Okay, last lecture of the day, I promise. First of all, I think we should all clap for Joanne and Terrence for putting on such a great event. Thanks for great job. It's a huge pleasure to be here among so many friends, old and new friends, and people whose work I admire so much. That's kind of a bonus for me for the event. I should mention two things, actually. Donna Haraway's name has come up a few times today, and rightfully so. I think her work, going back to the era of the book Primate Visions, is hugely important for what we're talking about today. And it was kind of animal studies before animal studies existed as a codified, fully emerged academic logo, I guess, as it is now. So I wanted to mention in that connection that there's a volume. This is a shameless plug for the series I edit, Post-Humanities series at University of Minnesota Press. There's a volume coming out between now and the end of May called Manifestly Haraway. I think you all will enjoy. We're taking the Cyborg Manifesto and the Companion Species Manifesto and putting them together in one volume. And at the end of it, Donna and I, about a year and a half, 2 years ago, put about 5 hours of conversation on tape at her house in Santa Cruz that we edited down probably to what's going to be a 40 or 50-page conversation between the two of us about the manifestos and about the relations and disrelations between them. So if you're into her work, and I bet almost all of you are, I'd check that volume out. A related volume that's coming out, kind of a sister volume by somebody I think of as kind of a sister scholar of hers, Vinciane Desprez. Her book called What Would Animals Say If We Asked the Right Questions is coming out at about the same time in the series. And actually Vinciane and Mark Dion did the two keynotes at a conference that Maria Whiteman and I hosted in November in Houston, and I thought it ended up being just a fantastic pairing. And her work is not as well known in the States as Donna's, but one of the most original thinkers, I think, about how we relate to non-human creatures in different contexts, including scientific contexts. So those are two books. Those are two books that I hope you'll, in the Post-Humanities series, I hope you'll check out. They'll be out soon. So I'm not gonna really talk about taxidermy per se really much, but everything I'm going to talk about is completely related to everything that this event is about, even though I'm going to talk about it more in the context of extinction. And issues that have come up today already around the archive and so on that we've discussed will emerge here a little bit as well. So let me begin by asking, what kind of event is extinction? To answer that question, we have to begin with an assertion that will seem paradoxical to some of you and commonsensical to others, that extinction is both the most natural thing in the world and at the same time is never and never could be natural. On the one hand, 99.9% of all species that have ever existed in the history of this planet are extinct. On the other hand, extinction can hardly be regarded as natural in any simple sense, and not just because, as a number of people have argued, nature, conceived as some realm apart, untouched and unshaped by human affairs, ceased to exist a long time ago, as all the recent talk about climate change and the Anthropocene makes clear. Beyond this, the psychoanalytically inclined among us point out that any human registration of the so-called fact of nature is always already radically denaturalized, because the symbolic and imaginary realms that make the presence of nature manifest to us in their different ways are anything but natural. As Slavoj Žižek put it now 25 years ago, and that seems weird to say that, but as he put it 25 years ago, quote, the fact that man is a speaking being means precisely that he is, so to speak, constitutively derailed, an open wound of the world, as Hegel put it, that excludes man forever from the circular movement of life, so that all attempts to regain a new balance between man and nature can only be a form of fetishistic disavowal. So when we ask, when a being, human or non-human, dies, what goes out of the world? When an entire species becomes extinct, what leaves the world? What world are we left with? We have to realize that to begin to answer those questions is to confront the fact that extinction, whatever else it may be, is never a generic event. That fact is on rather spectacular display in Michael Pestel's remarkable installation Requiem Ectopistis Migratorius, mounted in the fall of 2014, which centers not just on a species of bird, the passenger pigeon, the centennial of whose extinction the installation memorializes, but also the specter of a single bird, Martha, the last of her kind, who died in a display in the Cincinnati Zoo on September 1st, 1914. There's my taxidermy slide. I'll come back to the significance of this quite unusual fact in a moment, namely knowing the exact date of the extinction of an entire species, but I'll begin by noting that the centrality of Martha marks the extinction event of this particular species and of Pestel's installation as something quite qualitatively unusual, if not unique. At the center of this extremely complex work is a large, round wooden structure called Martha's Peel. The term peel refers here not to any kind of sheath, or use as a verb the removal of one, but to the small square defensive towers of the sort that were built in the 16th century in the border counties of England and Scotland, here mimicked by the 12 feet high by 8 feet in diameter wooden structure that resembles a large bird cage, with a rotating stool at its center and a video camera mounted on top to record the activities of those who momentarily inhabit the structure. And you can see up here in the upper left corner is the top-down shot from the camera looking down into the peel. Martha's Peel is paired with two other components that stand across from it. Passenger, a wooden train trestle of about 20 feet long supporting a modified O-scale train car that moves back and forth across its length, casting a shadow both inside and outside the trestle as it moves, where viewers are invited to sight down the length of the trestle as the train moves back and forth. And Peel's foe, consisting of a long palindrome inscribed on slate panels that sit above the train trestle, reading, "Peel's foe, not a set animal, laminates a tone of sleep." Pestel's been obsessed with anagrams and palindromes and so on for a long time. These elements thus provide part of the conceptual skeleton of the exhibition by alluding to two of the three main factors that contributed to the passenger pigeon's extinction, the rifle and the railroad, both of which are evoked by sighting down the interior of the train trestle. The role of the rifle will become clear enough in a moment, but the railroad, it should be noted, played a major role both in transporting hordes of hunters to the migratory roosting sites and, crucially, with the invention of refrigerated cars and shipping tons of fresh squab meat, as it was called then, to urban centers for sale and consumption. The third main factor in the bird's demise, the invention of the telegraph, allowed masses of hunters to be alerted about roosting locations where they could arrive in advance and make preparations for the massive slaughter. The telegraph, and specifically its iterability, is linked in the exhibition in numerous ways to writing, to pecking, to musical notation, and of course to the iterability of bird song itself, which include Flugel, Catalog of Extinct Birds, a cluster of elements including a grand piano, a musical composition that algorithmically translates the Latin names of almost 200 species of extinct birds into corresponding musical phrases, and a large collection of piano cluster boards, or PCBs, which you can see in the lower left-hand corner, utilizing spaced wooden dowels that, when placed down on the keys, automatically play the corresponding musical phrases, which means, of course, that the composition will continue to grow as more and more bird species become extinct. An element called erasure, which consists of a video of the names of extinct birds being written on a chalkboard and then erased, which is in turn shown on a small screen mounted above Martha's Peel, over here to the right, which can be viewed only through bird-watching binoculars. And one of three piano harps, which incorporates a 1914 Oliver typewriter as part of the instrumentation that viewers play to generate a sound field for a looping video of a dancing bird, Pigeon 98, and clearly the shape of the piano harps, like the shape of the typewriter mechanism itself, evoke the wings of a bird. And then unveiled, the rows of letters mounted on the glass wall at the entrance of the exhibition which I'll come back to later. And finally, the performances of Pestel himself at various times during the exhibition, which include improvisations on a large handmade wooden recorder called the Bird Machine that incorporates rows of various bird calls mounted to the side, and on a flute he plays that fires wadding of the sort used in muzzle-loading rifles into a gong that's mounted on one of the piano harps leaning against the wall to punctuate the performance. And so he'll start off, he'll kind of kick off the exhibition by playing this big recorder and whipping around this thing that's got rubber bands on it that makes this kind of woof, 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 woof sort of sound. And then he'll play the recorder and then go over here and do all this stuff on the bird calls and then come back. And then he eventually goes to a flute and he'll play all these sort of birdsong phrases on a flute and then blow really hard into it, and it shoots a piece of wadding out and hits this gong. So that's how the thing gets rolling. So there's a lot going on, obviously, in this show. So what we find here then in this exhibition is a complex conjugation of the relationship between time and space and how those are related to questions of code, of iterability, of technology, of notation, and performativity, all of which is in turn framed by the relationship of singularity and multiplicity that structures the entire story of the extinction of the passenger pigeon, with its poignant contrast between the singularity of Martha, the palsied 29-year-old sterile sole survivor of her kind, and what the species itself was most known for, as Stephanie, I think, noted earlier. Flocks that, according to John James Audubon's estimate, could number over 1 billion birds and were said to darken the skies for days at a time. As Anita Albus recounts Audubon's experience in her beautiful book On Rare Birds, quote, "Not one pigeon would land unless some of their millions of fiery red eyes could spy some woods with beech mast or acorns or field of wheat or rice for their millions of pitch-black bills. If a falcon tried to seize a bird in the flock, the pigeons quickly closed ranks into a compact mass, generating a roll of thunder with their beating wings. Like a living torrent, they plunged down in almost solid masses, and, as Audubon writes, darted forward in undulating and angular lines, descended and swept close over the earth with inconceivable velocity, mounted perpendicularly so as to resemble a vast column, and, when high, were seen wheeling and twisting with their continued lines, which then resembled the coils of a giant serpent." Albus continues, "Moved by the beauty of the spectacle, this painter of birds observed how one flock after the other would fly into the space where a pigeon had just escaped a falcon's talon, and how, even if no raptor were present, they would form a living river in the air and replicate the angles, curves, and undulations of the attacked flock before them. A single memory bonded millions of pigeons together," unquote. Practically speaking, this strategy of predator satiation, as it's called, is precisely what enabled the passenger pigeon's rapid demise once all the necessary technological ingredients were in place. In his ornithological biography, Audubon recounts the various strategies employed to produce the mass carnage that led to the passenger pigeon's extinction. Various sorts of firearms were used, of course, but also large pole and net contraptions that would garner thousands of birds at a time. Sulfur pots generated fumes that would asphyxiate birds by the thousands. Trees were felled as tens of thousands of nests and nestlings fell to the ground, and birds were poisoned with whiskey-soaked corn so that they could be rounded up easily, just to name some of the more tried and true strategies. Some Native Americans who had partaken of pigeon flesh as part of their subsistence for years found these methods disturbing, to say the least. Potawatomi leader Pokagon, disgusted by one 1880 massacre he had witnessed where birds were burned alive and nestlings exploded upon hitting the ground, wondered about what sort of punishment in the afterlife would be, quote, awaiting our white neighbors who have so wantonly butchered and driven from our forests these wild pigeons, the most beautiful flowers of the animal creation in North America, unquote. Both of these, the scene of slaughter and the moral indignation, are depicted in a famous scene in James Fenimore Cooper's The Pioneers, published in 1823, a novel that is a call to judgment, as Jerome McGann has recently argued, about the treatment of other species, other native peoples, as he puts it, during the period. As the massive flocks of passenger pigeons descend upon the town of Templeton in the novel, the people of the village are whipped into a frenzy, and along with the familiar pole and net contraptions, quote, every species of firearms was seen to be in the hands of the men and the boys, unquote. But the most significant of these is an old, small swivel cannon, once used to make inroads into the Indian settlements, as Cooper puts it, and later deployed for patriotic ceremonies such as 4th of July celebrations, but now filled with duck shot and fired into the passing columns of pigeons. As Leatherstocking observes the scene, he is, quote, a silent but uneasy spectator who is able to keep his sentiments to himself until he saw the introduction of the swivel into the sports, unquote. But then he objects, quoting again, it's wicked to be shooting into flocks in this wasty manner, to kill 20 and eat one. When I want such a thing, I go into the woods until I find one to my liking, and then I shoot him off the branches without touching the feather of another, though there might be 100 on the same tree, unquote. In the meantime, he says, taking his leave, quoting again, I wouldn't touch one of the harmless things that cover the ground here, looking up with their eyes on me as if they only wanted tongues to say their thoughts, unquote. Now, much could be said, of course, about all the various ethical and political dimensions of this scene, not least of all the use of the patriotic cannon to clear both Indians and pigeons, as it's put. But one of the things that Leatherstocking's response draws our attention to is the difference between multiplicity and singularity that frames the entire story of the passenger pigeon. Now, this image of the birds as a kind of superorganism or a swarm is an easy mark, I take it, for any armchair Deleuzian, and we find here, no doubt, an amazing trans-individual intensification that binds thousands, even millions of birds into something the Earth had rarely, if ever, seen. But I want to return now to the installation, and specifically to Martha, and ask what resides at the other pole of this configuration, the pole of singularity. What is Martha exactly? A pet? A fetish? A curiosity? A relic? We might say that her captivity, display, and proper name attempt to turn her into all of these things. But these compensatory gestures only underscore all the more that this is a case of fetishistic disavowal, not only of our own grotesque role in the extinction of her species, but also of our own finitude in relation to other forms of life, which calls forth these compensatory attempts to curate, you might say, the boundaries between life and death, survival and extinction. Indeed, as much of the media coverage around the centennial of the passenger pigeon reminds us, there has perhaps never been an individual organism who has been more the subject of curatorial care, both during and after life, than Martha. All of this and more is indexed, it seems to me, by the strange fact of having an exact date for the extinction of her species. As Derrida points out, a date, like a signature, is an attempt to fix that which cannot be fixed. It simultaneously marks that which happens only once, and that which, to be legible as a date, must be able, and unavoidably so, to come around again. As he puts it, the date marks, quote, the spectral revenance of that which, as a unique event in the world, will never come again. A date is a specter, but this revenance of impossible return is marked in the date, unquote. The resonance of Derrida's observation for the feature of Pestel's installation called Unveiled will become clear in a moment, but for now I simply want to register that on that date, September 1st, 1914, Martha became a specter, and not just in the sense of her taxidermied, curated body living on beyond her demise. In fact, she became an agent for a whole legion of hauntings, for as one journalist notes, quote, people kept seeing the birds after the flocks vanished, or devising outlandish theories to explain where they might have gone. The journal Science speculated that they were in the desert in Arizona. Another journal suggested they were east of the Puget Sound, and a lumberman claimed to have seen millions of them in Chile. Henry Ford was convinced that they had all drowned in the Pacific en route to Asia. The flocks were like phantom limbs that the country kept on feeling, unquote. But Martha is a specter in another way, haunting the attempt to fix and domesticate by deploying that discursive technology called dating, a more complex set of dynamics at work in the event called extinction that cannot be so easily tamed. In fact, Martha was already a specter before her death, the ghostly presence of a gaping absence, a hole in the life of the planet, and indeed, if we follow Cooper, in the life of the nation. After all, the passenger pigeon as a species, considered as a complex of system-environment interactions that evolve over time, both phylogenetically and ontogenetically, versus what we might call the simplex of the brute material persistence of her material body and her DNA, was already extinct before Martha died. In our attempt to locate and domesticate and fix these more complex dynamics of life and death and our imbrication in them by exercising a kind of phantasmatic sovereignty over the life-death relation in giving an exact date to the extinction of an entire species, in exercising a fetishistic level of curatorial control over Martha's existence and captivity, and so on, is registered, no doubt, in the sheer fact of Martha's name itself. Martha, who was named for the young widow of our nation's first president, the epitome of sovereignty for the young nation, if ever there was one. On this point, it's worth remembering that Martha was and remains part of an archive, as we've talked about earlier, in which the date, of course, plays a central, indeed constitutive role. In the case at hand, the archive of the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History, where she is, in the words of its curator of the Bird Division, quote, one of the Smithsonian's most iconic specimens, unquote. In this light, Martha's death and the extinction of her species in general is anything but a natural event, even as the archive and all of the curatorial protocols associated with it are meant to testify to the preservation of something that the archive does not create but merely records. Let me wet my whistle here. Or, to put it in other terms used by Derrida, the passenger pigeon is neither beast nor sovereign, all of which, to return now to Pestel's installation, is outed, as it were, in Martha's Peel, where we're invited to sit and spin around inside the cage, vocalize, excuse me, there we go. Yeah, sit and spin around the cage, vocalize or play an instrument in memory of Martha's bird song, and draw on the chalkboard floor somewhat as Martha would have rubbed her beak on a chalk block inside her cage, while as we spin, photographic stills from Edward Muybridge's famous series of the passenger pigeon whiz by, perhaps quickly enough to show the bird in flight, creating a kind of spectral reanimation. Is this a process of becoming bird, as the title of the live video projection of the inside of Martha's Peel suggests? Maybe, but only as a fantasy and a eulogy, because the point is that the birds are already gone, already a part of a historical record archived by Muybridge's photographs. We are, to be sure, invited to occupy our own version of Martha's space, perhaps to identify with her singularity and isolation by having our attention focused on our own. We are, in short, invited to open the question of the relationship between her finitude, her death, and our own. But in the end, I think we're brought back to the question of dwelling, to what constitutes a proper or appropriate form of dwelling, and for whom, with whom. Back, in fact, to Leatherstocking's protest, put an end, Judge, to your clearings. We're back, that is to say, to the relationship between dwelling and the eco of ecology, via the oikos that links it to the eco of economy, the oikos that marks off and delineates a home, inside from outside, as a place where the relation between organism and environment is stabilized, secured, even made calculable and economizable, the place where the eco of a bird species thousands of years old meets the eco of telegraphs, railroads, and cannons. The challenge we're faced with, then, is how to think a sense of dwelling divorced from property, the family, the proper name, such as Martha, and finally, from the sovereignty of which all of these are expressions. Indeed, part of the conceptual and emotional torque of Pestel's installation is the irony of Martha's final dwelling, a single bird in a cage, ironically enough, the last of a species known to move through the skies by the millions, like a superorganism. This testifies all the more, I think, to the necessity of thinking dwelling otherwise, perhaps as a migratory process, a process not of clearing, but of passing through, like the passenger pigeon whose name derives from the French passager, passing by, what Derrida, in a second set of seminars on the Beast and the Sovereign, calls a movement without repose. In another sense, as I've already suggested, what we have here in Martha's Peel and in the installation generally is a kind of collocation or crossing of radically different temporalities that are central to thinking the problem of ecology and ecological poetics. On the one hand, the calculable, bankable, economizable clock and calendar time of our mode of dwelling, which enables us to say that the passenger pigeon went extinct precisely on September 1st, 1914, and a much more complex and multidimensional kind of temporality made manifest in specific system-environment relationships both ontogenetically and phylogenetically, so that, for example, Martha both is and is not a passenger pigeon as she sits in her cage in the Cincinnati Zoo. On the one hand, the biophysiology and its associated traits of her species still obtain in her person, even though she is long separated from the environment and behaviors that made her what she is. In this sense, she can still feel pain, feel alone, needs rest and nourishment, and so on. But on the other hand, those physical characteristics and behavioral traits did not evolve as a result of her and her kind living in cages for thousands of years. She is, in that sense, precisely both a trace and a specter, as Derrida puts it, and she marks how the crossing of these two modes of dwelling, these two ecos, constitutes a time, as Derrida puts it, borrowing from Shakespeare, that is out of joint. This complex nexus of concerns, temporalities, dwelling, ecologies, and iterability is put very much on the front burner by other elements in the installation. In the component 8 Voices Before Columbus, which references the names for the passenger pigeon used by the Lenape, Ojibwe, Kaskaskia, Mohawk, Choctaw, Seneca, and Narragansett Indians, where viewers are invited to drop an acorn, a key food source for the passenger pigeon, into the podium after reciting the name of an extinct bird species, which takes us back, of course, to our discussion of Cooper's The Pioneers, and most of all, in the component called Unveiling, the glass wall entrance to the gallery, on which are printed letters that turn out to be fragments of the mitochondrial genome sequence of the passenger pigeon supplied by Ben Novak, who is working with the Long Now Foundation in its Revive and Restore program to bring back the passenger pigeon as part of a larger de-extinction project involving several species. The complexities of the de-extinction process, let alone the debates about its viability and ethics, are far too detailed to go into here. Suffice it to say that there's plenty to explore online, and in fact an entire TEDx conference was devoted to the topic of de-extinction. But even its proponents realize that the relationship between temporality and materiality here is quite layered and textured, not just in retrieving 100-year-old DNA and inserting it into band-tailed pigeons to produce viable offspring, but also, and more crucially, in the raising and socialization of the newly hatched pigeons themselves, which involves all sorts of factors such as training them for migration routes, ensuring habitat viability and associated dietary needs, and so on. The miracle with de-extinction initially seems to be that we can make time go backwards, a temporal loop that bears interesting lines of relation to the palindrome in Peele's Foe. But that dream is complicated by the fact that there are other slower and more multidimensional temporalities at work here than what we find in the laboratory, in the environmental factors affecting biomorphology and development, in the processes of imprinting, social learning, and communication, and much else besides. In other words, as Christopher Johnson puts it, genetic code is, quote, both regulating before but also regulated after, in the sense that its program is executed in a context that's perpetually changing, hence perpetually modifying the conditions of possibility for the code, unquote. And this draws our attention once again to the importance of tending to the non-generic nature of the system-environment relationship as that unfolds not just as a synchronic paradigm or diagram, to use Deleuze's language, but in real time, subject to recursive contingencies that may be, and often are, redoubled in nonlinear ways, as so much recent work on epigenetics has shown. In a way, then, the simple part of all this is the apparent miracle of completing the genetic sequence of a long-dead animal and implanting it into closely related birds who will create the proper offspring. This bundle of complexities is important to remember, for the danger in this new script of life, as Julian Murfitt terms it in relation to de-extinction efforts around the woolly mammoth, is that, quote, it is playing out along the prototypical contemporary twin axes of commodity production and scientific molecularization, so that it, quote, has nothing to do with the molar form or representational shape of the creature and everything to do with parcelized units of production on the one hand and strings of mappable code on the other. Two correlated models of futurity, he continues, are implicit in this new script: the implicit eternity of the market and the promise of species revival whose innermost impulse is simply the infinite manipulability of life itself, unquote. And this came up in one of the earlier talks. The question of scripts of life is certainly in play in Pestel's installation, and not only in the contrast between the time-based writing and erasure of chalk on a board in the piece Erasure, which requires, importantly, the prosthetic device of birdwatching binoculars to be viewed at all, and the clean synchronic rows of letters of Unveiled. And not only in the PCBs and the catalog of extinct birds, with this algorithmic translation of Latin names to musical notation, but also in the fact that the palindrome of Peale's foe is inscribed on pieces of slate, emphasizing both the lamination of the stones themselves and the tone of sleep of geological time that forgets the passing of 99.9% of all species that have ever existed, reminding us that the lamina of lamination means bone. We are all, in some sense, and at some time scale, extinct, living fossils, specters. As for unveiling, much could be said here about glass and windows, both the architectural innovation and the computer operating system, in relation to processes of capture that I can't go into here in any detail. Both the glass window and the graphically based computer interface tantalizingly make available and unavailable at the same time the object of our gaze, inviting us into a process of capture where the object of our desire is phantasmatically fixed, located, and displayed, but only in a spatial transaction in which we can reach to, but not through. But I'd like to see in Pestel's glass wall, which at first promises to unveil not just the installation, but the underlying truth of the passenger pigeon itself, presumably in the form of genetic code with all the attendant metaphors of the Book of Life and so on, I'd like to see in Pestel's installation an agnostic, if not indeed cautionary note, one that reaches back to Marcel Duchamp's concept of delay at work in his famous piece, The Large Glass, the Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelors, all of which is evoked by the title of this component of the installation, Unveiled, with the fetishized Martha now standing in the position of the bride in Duchamp's famous work. Now, such an association, granted, might seem far-fetched, were it not for the fact of an intervening work of art, chronologically speaking, that provides a key bridge between the two works. Mel Chin's early piece, Bird in a Cage, which is in fact a portrait on glass of Martha that explicitly references Duchamp's large glass and the concept of delay, as Chin and others have emphasized. As Gerald Siegel puts it in his book on Duchamp, the artist uses the term delay to mark, quote, the large glass itself as, quote, an icon of perpetually forestalled communication. And many critics of de-extinction seem to feel that the complexities of forestalled communication are exactly what gets swept under the rug by visions of a seamless translation of molecular genetic code to molar forms of life. Among the ideas Duchamp treasured in this way, Siegel continued, were those given voice in the notes on shop windows, where the truth that the world we inhabit is external to ourselves is proved by the disillusionment that comes when we attempt to satisfy desire with the objects life offers, unquote. An ascription whose connection to Murfitt's scripts of life and its collation of code and the market is, I think, clear enough. The persona of the large glass, he continues, and I'm quoting again, remained forever in the condition of the window gazer, whose state of being is expanded and animated by desire without ever experiencing the regret and disillusionment that follow from material possession, unquote. Pestel's glass, in other words, holds out to us the hope that the passenger pigeon may yet live again, and yet cautions us not to look at the species or Martha through a shop window that too readily links genetic code, market, temporality, and what we call life, capital L. And in this sense, what is unveiled is both the psychic complex of our investment in Martha's plight and the hopes of de-extinction, the diorama, as it were, of our guilt, our desire, and our hope, and the dangers attendant upon all of these. Finally, and this perhaps hardly needs emphasizing at this point, this is my last paragraph, what draws me to this reading even more is the salient presence of both performativity and performance in Pestel's installation. It's already there, of course, in the multidimensional incorporation of script and writing, of musical notation, genetic code, video copying, and rebroadcast, and prostheticity, from writing and erasure on a blackboard to the PCBs and their denaturalization of the algorithm between Latin nomenclature and musical notation and expression, in the medium of wood, no less, to the pecking of pigeons used in scientific experiments and its associations with both the iterability of birdsong and human speech, to the palindrome of Peele's foe, and a whole lot else besides. These aspects of the installation are only redoubled and intensified, of course, by Pestel's incorporation of his own improvisational practices and those of the viewer, which become part of the unfolding of the work itself in time. Performance and performativity are made to disrupt and, as it were, laminate or delaminate each other, clouding the glass through which the meaning of the event before us is unveiled. And in this sense, Pestel's installation is, in fact, I think, neither a code nor a script, but as Derrida might put it, a space in which we confront the fact that scripts and codes aren't the end of the story of life, but only the beginning. Thank you. And now for the roving microphone. Yeah.
The date, September 1st, 1914, is very striking to me. That's when another kind of extinction among humans was really setting off. I mean, that's the very beginning of the First World War, where, you know, two major forces which had, they believed, the ability to annihilate the other were facing off across a very small trench. And another thing is that was occurring at that same time was the conception of the large glass. I mean, at about that time, Duchamp was formulating the ideas that his final glass would take. So I'd like to know how that temporal context would, or was considered in the exhibition, or your thinking about it.
Well, I really have not thought about this, about the context of World War I, much less written about it in this piece, but I mean, I do think it's germane in two senses that have already come up multiple times today. One has to do with the nature of the archive itself, and this is compressed, I think, in Derrida's remarks on the nature of actually of the discursive technology of dating, actually itself, of exact dating. And that is that, as came up in Petra's talk, I think the archive is interesting because it brings together the national and the natural in the same space. So the way Derrida puts this in Archive Fever that I think is very interesting is he says, look, on the one hand, the archive supposedly archives what it archives because it's archiving something that is absolutely external to human affairs and deserves to be remembered and curated and given this kind of scientific attention in the most objective ways possible. And on the other hand, there is no archive without law, which is to say without sovereignty. And so you have these two principles of what apparently happens over there where things occur out in the world, the so-called outside world, and at the same time what happens here in the space where law is given, where disciplinary protocols are determined and formed, and so on. Those two things come together in the archive. And so what we think of as these opposites of the so-called natural world and the so-called political or ideological world are actually really tightly bound up and iterated each time in archival practices. The other, I think, relevant context for this that's all over the place, I think not just in my paper, but I think in everything we've talked about today and what this show is about, is the fact that you can't talk about any of these topics without finally always circling back to a kind of symptomatics of our relationship to our own finitude and to the ways that we try to hold at bay our own finitude by these various kinds of practices. And this becomes really interesting, I think, in the context of the whole de-extinction thing, because there's clearly, I mean, it is a diorama of our own guilt and our own culpability. And, if you watch Stuart Brand, as you all may know, is the guy who started the Long Now Foundation. This is the Stuart Brand, for those of you who are my age or older. This is the Stuart Brand of Whole Earth Catalog first and then Coevolution Quarterly. The Stuart Brand who was influenced by actually first-generation systems theory of the sort that Gregory Bateson was doing, and also by Buckminster Fuller, right? So there's a kind of through line here to what Brand is doing now with the Long Now Foundation. If you watch his TEDx lecture about de-extinction, he ends up at the end of it talking about the passenger pigeon, and he almost actually starts crying. And you can tell that it's as if he feels he's bearing the burden, of an entire species, in this case Homo sapiens, for everything we've done to the planet and to these other creatures. And so a lot of people want to say, well, that makes the de-extinction thing bullshit. I don't think it makes it bullshit, because I don't think that can be expunged from our relationship to other forms of life and our relationship to ecological questions. And so one connection with the context of the world wars, to put it telegraphically, would be the extent to which those kinds of conflicts are driven by our own kind of hysterical kind of disavowal of our own finitude and our own mortality and our attempts to somehow live on beyond ourselves in some nationalistic project. So in this piece, that seems like such a huge a huge thing to kind of take up, but I think you're right. It's because of the date. It's in a way kind of unavoidable to take up. Yeah, I think you have to write that paper. and about its relation to Duchamp.
I'm trying to see if I can formulate this correctly. I think that what we've seen with a lot of artists is that they have had an influence on Natural History Museum, and their actions, their artwork, and so on has made the institution change. And maybe summing it up, in some ways we've felt that the didactic narrative that were ongoing, whether it was the colonial, the public education project, and so on, artists would instead open up the mystery in a way, and open up the field in some ways. So I have a question. I'm not thinking that Pestel's work isn't valid. I think it's very valid, but I'm actually almost want to put it in the context of art, Because for me, it becomes now a project where actually the artist becomes the curator of a museum. And for me, it's a didactic project. So it becomes a very interesting point where we are back there, where actually he should be hired by museums to do this project. So we've put it up against, for example, Duchamp's large glass,
Right.
which I would call an impossible proposition, for example.
Right.
It is enigma. And there is an enigma in what artists do, and that is fundamental to something we call an artwork. So I know I'm in dangerous territory here, but can you kind of address that issue?
No, I don't think that's dangerous territory. I think that's totally commonsensical territory. I completely agree with you that there's always I mean, the way I would put it, to rephrase this enigma that you're talking about, is I think what artworks do is they provide a vanishing point for a multitude of different readings, different forms of expertise, different kind of affective and psychological investments and so on, you know, that are in principle infinite, actually, and inexhaustible. And, you know, then I think the interesting question becomes, what's the relationship between that fact and the details of the artwork, and how particular artworks do this, you know? So, yeah, actually, this piece, the talk I gave today, sometimes I give it as half of a talk, the other half of which is about Mark and Brendis's Condor work that Mark just talked about a moment ago. And, you know, one detail that makes that work different, that Mark focused on, is precisely the fact of the scientific archive, in the context of the scientific archive, around a species that is the subject of intense legal and political protection, namely the California condor. And so that overdetermines, I think, what's going on in that piece and the function of the archive in that piece in relation to so-called life, in a way that's very different from other artworks. And it's actually even different from the archive that obtains here with the passenger pigeon, because of the curious and weird fact of the singularity of the specimen Martha, which you don't have in the story of the condors. And so you have the dynamics of an archive at work in both of these pieces, with everything that I just said a moment ago about the relationship between the natural and the national being operative, but it plays out very differently, I think, in both pieces, even though both pieces are about, on some level, extinction and about bird species, you know. So for me, the interesting question is how does that vanishing point or that enigma take a particular kind of iterative shape in particular kinds of artworks that then people have all sorts of different kinds of investments in. And one thing that's interesting about, and then I'll shut up. One thing that's interesting about Pestel's work is that he's actually trained, he's really trained as a musician and in musical theory. So he's done a lot of improvisational, he's done work with Anthony Braxton and other kinds of improvisational work. He has an ongoing collaboration with one of the top Budo dancers in the world that was actually part of this show at the end of the show that they put on at Lafayette College. And so he comes at doing installation work from an angle that's different from somebody who's not trained in musical theory and aware. I think a lot of the stuff in the show about iteration, notation, song, pecking, sound, you know, is really has to do with the fact that he's coming out of that background, which is different from, you know, what another artist would do with it. That's the beginning of a beginning of an answer to your to your question. Professor Wills of the Brown faculty, no less.
So, extinction, right? If you want us to understand extinction as something that's not opposite to survival, because you've introduced survival in the Derridian sense, right, of a survivance or living on, right? So once you've done that, extinction, it seems to me, can't function in any absolute sense.
Agreed.
Sorry?
Agreed.
Right. I thought you would. So then, what about de-extinction? What is it that troubles you about de-extinction? Why wouldn't it be another form of survival, and why wouldn't it be a rewriting of that presumed opposition between extinction and survival that seems not to be operable anymore? I mean, can you flesh that out a bit?
Yeah, I'm agnostic on de-extinction, and I think you have to be agnostic on de-extinction. I feel about de-extinction exactly the way Derrida feels about cloning in the book Rogues, which is, and the point he makes about cloning in Rogues is to say that, look, people who are absolutely opposed to cloning and people who absolutely support cloning actually share a deeper identity. And that deeper identity is actually not wanting to deal with the fact, as I would put it, that the iterability of the system-environment relation is not generic. And it's dynamic, and it's time-bound, and it's different for every species. And so for me, it's not a oh, technology is good or bad, de-extinction is good or bad question. It's really a question of you have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. And so one of the reasons passenger pigeons are high on the list of de-extinction projects is that there are a lot of behaviors in this particular species that are hardwired that actually have to be learned in other bird species. And so when you start thinking about the pragmatics of actually making this happen, which, by the way, the scientists like Ben Novak are quite well aware of. I mean, it's not as if they have some, Jurassic Park fantasy. They're quite aware of the complexities of trying to do something like this. So I think for that reason, I totally agree. I think you have to be agnostic on the issue of de-extinction, and all within the framework, as you point out, that finally all extinction is a matter of time frames. I mean, 99.9% of the species that have ever existed have been extinct, and the rest will be in some time frame. So I think you're absolutely right. There's no fault line between the two. Can't be any fault line between the two. But so I would say that then when you start thinking about the woolly mammoth and you start thinking about the passenger pigeon and the 8 or 9 top candidates, the factors around the good or bad idea-ness of doing it with each species are really, really different in each case. And they involve habitat, they involve proportionate learning, they involve really gnarly legal issues. There's a famous law paper called How to Permit Your Mammoth, which is about legal complications around de-extinction of certain species. So there's a long list of these factors in each case that I think have to be tended to on a case-by-case basis. So I'm agnostic on de-extinction. Thank you. Thanks, Joanne.